Welcome. People are still drifting in. As we gather virtually from across the country, we recognize that we're participating on many different plans, and we have participants from all over Turtle Island. So pleased you can all be here today. We have some light snow, cold weather here. In today's session, we are excited to share the Future of Labs final report. As one person said, the band's back together. The Future of Labs report is a comprehensive piece produced in collaboration with Action Lab and the diverse group of experienced social innovators and practitioners. It's very much a co-created document. It's based on insights and discussions from the 2024 Future of Labs gathering on Cortez Island, as well as consultations and conversations that led up to that. There were experts that came together to reflect on the current landscape and future direction for social innovation labs in Canada. It was really a group of folks that were doing the work. Many people that couldn't be there, as we said, also were able to engage with that group in advance. So over the next hour, we will explore how social innovation labs will shape the next decade of systems change, or could shape the next decade of system change, by addressing complex challenges and fostering collaboration across sectors. You'll hear key recommendations, next steps, and critical questions that emerged from the report, all aimed at enhancing the future effectiveness and reach these labs and future effectiveness and reach of these labs in driving positive transformative change. I really encourage you to check out the primer report that was created before the labs gathering, and there's some amazing podcasts as well as the final report. It's kind of a cumulative effect of which today's webinar is kind of the cherry on the top. So we're going to hear from folks that were very in-depth in all of that work. We're joined by this panel of speakers that I'm so honored to introduce. Mark Kabaj, president from Here to There Consulting. Marlika Kibum, design director, public service of British Columbia, Canada, and also a fellow practitioner. Paige Reeves, director of research and social innovation at the Skills Society. Rebecca Rubilak, director of continuous improvement and innovation Skills Society, and Ben Weinlich, executive director, Skills Society. And I just want to acknowledge the Skills Society, who also have the Action Lab, and they were really such a driving force in all of this work. Paige will be moderating our session. Paige and Rebecca will be co-moderators, and it will begin with a panel discussion followed by some time for the audience to do questions and answers. And we encourage you to put any questions, comments, or thoughts in the chat as we go along. The webinar is part of this Possibility Space series where we really think about what is the possibility of social innovation and how can we bring together practitioners, innovators, and change makers to share transformative ideas to drive positive change. Thank you again for being here, and I look forward to an engaging discussion. I will now pass this on to Rebecca and Paige to lead us through our conversation today.
Thanks, Andrea, for that warm beginning and welcome. And thanks, everyone, for coming to this possibility space. I'm Paige, and this is Rebecca. We're joining from Treaty 6, Edmonton. And as Andrea mentioned, we work at Skills Society Action Lab. We've been involved as conveners of the Future of Labs and are thrilled to be here as moderators for today's panel. So I'm going to provide just a little bit more context about the Future of Labs and its original intentions before we dive in to our panel discussion. So the Future of Labs is a group of trailblazers and experienced innovators who steward and design collective problem-solving processes and share a common goal of creating more impactful practices. And as Andrea mentioned, in May 2024, a group of these lab practitioners gathered at Hollyhock on Cortez Island, British Columbia. The gathering was really a catalyst for shaping the next 10 years of lab approaches, looking deeply at what's been working, not working, and collectively visioning next practices for the field. And leading up to the gathering, the group created a primer document that synthesized some of the history of the labs movement in Canada, as well as different thought lineages, philosophy, and practices that have influenced the development of labs today. Sharing findings from the gathering, the group has developed a report with recommendations for the next 10 years of social innovation labs. And then finally, key insights and learnings have been captured in the 3 podcast episodes mentioned. So all of these knowledge products are linked in the chat, so feel free to click on them and check them out at your leisure. I'm going to pass it to Rebecca now, who's going to give a little bit more of an introduction to the panelists today.
Thanks, Paige. Welcome everyone. Really honored to get to introduce this group of stellar humans who collectively have a really rich background and experience in social innovation labs, and each contributed a lot to the stewardship of the Future of Labs gathering. So to begin, I'd like to introduce Mark Kabaj. Mark is the president of the consulting company From Here to There. He worked in Eastern Europe after the fall of the Berlin Wall with international development organizations, including the mission coordinator for the United Nations Development Program's Regional Economic Structuring Program in Poland. Back in Canada, he was involved in place-based change programs, including coordinator of Canada's first collective impact approach to poverty reduction in Waterloo region, was in the executive director role at the Canadian Community Economic Development Network, and executive director of Vibrant Communities Canada with Tamarack Institute. Mark's current focus is on developing practical ways to understand, plan, and evaluate efforts to address complex issues. And he's particularly involved in developing and promoting developmental evaluation, a new approach to assessment, which emphasizes real-time feedback and learning in emerging, messy, and often fast-moving environments. Mark was part of the convening group, really supported the developmental evaluation of the Future of Labs, and we're just so grateful to have him today and to join us. Next, I'll introduce Marlika Kaiboom. Marlika is an anthropologist with specializations in conflict studies and complex emergency management. Marlika worked as a researcher, designer, and social innovator across Europe and Canada, always fostering cross-organizational collaborations and transformative change. She was at the forefront of the labs movement in Europe in the early 2010s, and her expertise includes systemic design, service design, and building infrastructures that foster the well-being of communities, places, and nature. Marlika is currently a design director with the Public Service of British Columbia, but for today's session, she will be speaking on personal title. We were really honored and grateful to have Marlika be part of the facilitation group and helped steward and lead some really important conversations on the island. So really grateful to have Marlika here as well. And lastly, Ben Weilich, Executive Director of Skills Society and founder of the Action Lab. Ben was instrumental in developing the Action Lab and has been deeply involved in systems change work through stewarding think tanks and social innovation for the last 15 years. He is the founder of an innovation consultancy network called ThinkJar Collective and co-founder of a tangible social innovation called My Compass Planning that's scaling across North America. Ben is passionate about helping people, organizations, and systems to get better at navigating complex challenges together. And we hold a lot of gratitude for Ben for bringing this collective together and starting these conversations for the future of labs. So we've got a really beautiful cross-diverse section of experiences, both locally and internationally. And I'll throw it over to Paige to kick us off.
Sure, thanks. So we'll start digging in now. And I think we're going to begin with where and how all of this started. So I'll toss the mic to you, Ben, if you don't mind sharing a little bit about kind of what precipitated the Future of Labs, why this type of gathering now?
Yeah, no, just first off, really nice to be here, seeing people in the chat. There's a lot of OG lab practitioners that have done a lot for the field that are here listening. And so there's a lot of wisdom in the room around this, and honored to come and chat about all this with everyone. I think part of it that sparked it, I mean, as things started to get more complex, some people think maybe the stuff started to get weirder after David Bowie died in about 2016, and things kind of got different from there. But somewhere along there, and with the pandemic, there were a lot of people that were doing stuff around social innovation labs, and then it kind of went quiet, and there wasn't really kind of a review of what happened with that. And a lot of people were talking about other things after that. And we kind of thought it's important to come together for people that have really gone through it with labs, have really tried them in different ways. And let's see, what worked, what might not have worked, what might need to be better, what might need to evolve. And if there was still energy for these things called social innovation labs, and allowing for some kind of coherent definition and way that we can kind of mostly agree on, which is one of the hardest parts we'll get into around what are labs essentially, but also allowing for lots of diversity of ways that labs show up. So it kind of was, I sent out a call to a bunch of people across Canada and internationally and said, here, are you noticing this? Do we want to kind of look at where labs are at and what we might need to learn from them again? And overwhelmingly, a lot of people said, yes, we're noticing some shifts here. We should review this, take a look at this. And that sort of sparked this collective to come together on Hollyhock, and a lot of the prep work and the writing of the primer that also Paige and Rebecca were very deeply involved with, and a lot of others, Diane Rusin, Patrick Dubé, and others around that. So that's kind of the spark of it. We just really wanted to see, is there still something to labs, and where do they help and where do they fit with it? So that began, and now we're here like a year and a half later or something like that. And that's really interesting stuff to share about what we learned.
Awesome. Thanks for setting us up, Ben. I just want to add a little bit more context before we kind of dive into the first question for the group. So for folks who might be new or just learning about Future of Labs, on Cortes Island, practitioners really dug into 5 key questions about the future of social innovation labs. And while it's not linear and it's quite iterative, the intention of the conversations and the questions kind of built to kind of inform one after the other. So we started around, what do we mean by social innovation labs, kind of trying to have some coherence around some key definitions and pieces that make up a social innovation lab. And then from there, with that shared understanding, we said, okay, then what is the unique contribution to social change? What's the niche of social innovation labs within the broader social change ecosystem? Following that, we explored what's reasonable to expect, both from the scale, pace, and durability of lab results. So what are reasonable expectations from a social innovation lab approach? Followed by the capabilities, mindsets, methods, skills, looking ahead to say what's needed to design and manage and evaluate high quality social innovation labs going into the future. And after these really rich conversations, we then looked ahead to the future to kind of say, okay, given all of this, what kind of an ecosystem do we need to ensure that this lab movement and individual labs within it can really thrive? So those 5 conversations are really what led to what we heard in the report following research pre and post gathering. And the final gathering report can be found on the website, but within it are these 5 bold recommendations for building the future of labs in Canada, and what we're going to dig in today with the panelists. I'll quickly read them here to give some context, but the first was to develop a manifesto on the role of innovation in the social change sector, continue lab field building efforts, which I think today really contributes to bringing people together, test the lab value proposition with funders, seek funding to support focused experimentation around future lab processes and methods, and lastly, lead into a grounded national missions approach. So we're going to be digging into those, as I mentioned, but you can learn more about them in the final report, or if you're more of an auditory learner, we also have that final podcast that shares a bit about that too. Okay, turning back to the wonderful folks in the room here. Many people shared and said, we left the gathering feeling really reaffirmed that labs are in fact not dead. And they're really an important part of the social innovation ecosystem in Canada. So if this is true, really want to hear from each of you, what role can labs play in strengthening this social innovation ecosystem in Canada? And whoever is feeling like they'd like to speak first, feel free to unmute.
Sure, I'll go first. Hi, my name is Marlika. I'm so pleased to be here. This is such a great question. What role can labs play in strengthening the social innovation ecosystem in Canada? I think if I were to put it like this, I think 80 or 90% of my time, I'm being requested to like really show up in the old ways of doing. And we're entering a really quite complex time in terms of a poly crisis and the meta crisis and what's happening across the border and globally. And I think these labs are really these spaces, little beautiful islands of creativity and experimentation that we so direly need. And it is really a space for me personally also to shift my ideas and to keep focusing on a thriving humanity in a time of huge polarization. And in that regard, I think coming together over these big questions, and whether you call it a lab or something else, and whether you put a lot of methodology in it or not, it is really for that other 20% to really shift. And that's something that I felt personally also by going to Hollyhock. I showed up pretty tired from having to do this big fight all the time. And I came back so revived and so energized. And I was like, wow, these people, I want to keep following them around and keep working together. So yeah, that would be my answer to that big question. Who would like to take it on next?
Ben, do you want to go? No. Yeah, thanks, Marlika. Hi, everyone. Mark again here from Edmonton, Treaty 6 country. I for sure feel the same way, Marlika, and I would also say that what I think is, in addition, it's a powerful island of experimentation, and I'm really drawn to the way Rios talks about stubborn societal problems, where they say that if stubborn societal problems are stuck in systems, we have to be systemic in our thinking and action. If no one person can impose a solution on their own or sector, there's lots of parties in the room, we have to be participatory in them. And if solutions aren't known in advance, or at least good ones, we probably should be experimental. And so I really think around complex things, it's one of the few methodologies that tries to take all those things seriously and saying this is a platform or a space or a process that is experimental, participatory, and systemic in action. And if we do this well, not only can we maybe address the democratic deficit or the polarization challenge, but we can also dramatically improve the solution set. And it is a niche approach to innovation. There's still a place for accelerators and demonstration projects and pilots on the experimental stream. And there's a lot of other ways to think systemic and be participatory. But this feels like not a powerful niche approach that I think everyone should at least be conversant in if we're serious about change making.
Nice, thanks, Mark. Yeah, I think one of the things we were clear on throughout the report and throughout the gathering is nobody thinks that labs are the answer to every type of situation or every complex challenge. There's a particular niche for them in certain contexts that they can be helpful. Building, like, there's an element, and when I first got into this work, coming from kind of disability justice work and doing kind of grassroots community organizing at first, the thing that was really interesting about labs was this sort of tapping into this potential creativity of a hive mind, that you would get ideas that you would not be able to get if you were just working alone, or if you were just looking at just kind of the literature, the research on something. There's something that gets unlocked through labs, through those relationships, through looking at systems, through people looking at all these things together, centering folks with lived experience, also talking to the system leaders around a complex challenge, looking at all those pieces, that really interesting pathways, possibilities, solutions, which is a tricky thing. We navigated around whether labs are trying to get at solutions or what comes out of them. But all of those possibilities can be unlocked when we kind of bring this hive mind together. So I think there's something to that is still valuable to the ecosystem. And we need to maybe get better at knowing when to use them and when not. So a couple of things that we kind of learned and came out was, if you have an immediate, like, political situation where we need some answers really quick that fit really tightly in strategic priorities, probably a social innovation lab is not the thing you want to do within that period of time. You might be able to use some tools of social innovation labs to do some community engagements, and that's all good, but that it might not be the full lab around those kinds of things. So when you have time and you have kind of a people in a system that want to come and engage around a complex challenge, and they're willing to kind of not just push their agenda, but they're willing to see other perspectives and really kind of build on that together. And then you might have the chance for a lab, and you're willing to also try some creative approaches, methods, possibilities to explore. Those are some general, high level kind of things. There's a lot more depth to it, but I think there's still real value in harnessing that also, so that we're not just doing band-aid solutions, but focusing more on the deeper root cause stuff that labs can help with.
Awesome. Thanks, Ben. Yeah, really, really resonating with everything that's been shared. And, as Marlika said, we're facing increasing polarization and polycrisis. And so being able to be clear and understand the niche, and then understand how we can contribute and support other social innovation approaches. We don't all have to play the same instrument as Mark, to quote Mark. And so having appreciation and recognition and understanding of the other players, but being clear on when and when not a social innovation lab. I'll throw it over to Paige for the next question.
Awesome. So as we look ahead to strengthening the ecosystem and building the future of labs, I'm wondering if each of you could kind of pick one action that you think would be most impactful in strengthening the lab ecosystem in Canada, and why you think that's a good lever to pull.
You want to maintain the order, Malika?
Sure. Yeah, thanks. This is again a good question. I had to think about it, and I'm totally gonna sound like a lab grandma right now. But the 2010s, which is actually 15 years ago, were pretty profound in Europe in terms of, post-economic recession, various countries, Iceland, like so affected by what had happened. And there was a real beautiful, start of a social innovation movement. And Diogo Vasconcelos, who was a Portuguese politician, he sadly passed away too early in his beautiful life, but he was the, I think, Social Innovation Exchange founder as well. And he started, I think he wrote something like that, which is like a social innovation manifesto at European Commission level. And it was super impactful to start a movement around it. And then I think when was it, 2017 or something, it was repeated, and it was called Transformative Social Innovation Manifesto, which was written across a variety of sectors and people came forward from transit research. And so it might actually be indeed time to think again about writing something collectively across organizations and people about the value of labs within social innovation, and especially now take that decolonizing lens and really include an even wider variety of voices and a wider variety of organizations. But the beauty is not maybe in the outcome of the manifesto, but potentially in like the collective writing process of it. It was definitely one of the ideas that came forward from our time together in Hollyhock that really sparked something with me. And I thought, yeah, maybe it's time to do that.
Well, I'll follow that. I think I could have, when I looked at the list of recommendations to get me thinking about this, I know how hard we worked as a big team to come up with those, and you stewarding us to come to those. So I don't feel the urge to pick one. I think they're all important for different reasons, and maybe it's good to use this as an excuse to talk about why each is important in different ways. So thank you, Marlika, for confirming the manifesto. That was my first stop, actually. And then I went to the second one. I said, well, that's important too. So the one that I think about the most of those is I like the idea of trying to, maybe this is related to this, confirm that labs are an option in an enormous number of contexts. And I think we should be, rather than saying here's a lab, I think we should have to be really thoughtful about what are the different kinds of contexts in which lab-like processes and orientations can be really useful. And I'm not really into exhaustive taxonomies or anything like that, but I do think we should be much more explicit and make these things much more visible. So Ben, you shared an example of where a lab might not be useful, and I think we should have more of those, right? Don't reach for a lab in these instances. They'll just be crying at the end of it. But where could we use it in multiple other multi-stakeholder processes, including, if polarization is an issue, and it is, there might be some cases where you'd say, I like the lab because of the participatory nature, and while we might generate some experimental outcomes, this is really a useful approach to developing insight and empathy and relationships and connections between people, because if we don't do that foundational stuff, we ain't going anywhere. So I have an urge to make that work much more visible, where labs as an orientation and a methodology, they're not a strategy. They're a methodology that is embedded in a strategy. What are all the contexts and strategies in which, not all of them, but more of them, that these things might be useful? So I think that would expand the user set quite a bit.
Yeah, no, Mark, I agree, and I think all five of them they are really helpful around it. I think I'm thinking about something Tim Draymond said in the last podcast where he's like, one of the challenges is, and what, with labs getting funded, is most of the money in funding ways goes towards services and programs. Like Rebecca Page and I were leads of a large disability service organization, 25 million a year, and it's service delivery for the most part, right? And it's really hard for systems to think about the importance of investing in experimentation and thinking about, are we really helping people and systems to thrive and be better around that? And so how to get to that is probably not doing more of the which we need to do also, but to get to that level so that philanthropy, so that governments, so that citizens can understand the value of experimentation to get better, to make systems more humanized and better for people and planet. To get to that, the manifesto thing or a missions approach or something around that to create some narrative to be able to understand the value of that is really important and necessary. Because if we don't have that, then it's just going to be a similar thing where we're going for a little bit of funding on a really niche, complex challenge to a community. And, we need to do those things, but it's going to be really hard to get the impact that we all want around these tough challenges. So I do think there's the big picture, the manifesto thing that Marlika hit on, and the missions approach, a grounded missions approach, which maybe we can talk a little bit more later, but those are two big ones. And from some on the ground stuff, I also really like one of the recommendations for the practitioners around it is if we could raise some funds to do a bit of experimental, have some grants or some small amount of funds so that people could experiment with processes and methods and kind of build that together with communities, decolonize methods, that's a big piece, and experiment in that way, and then share that learning to the community and try those things. So that's a more on the ground one. So and then the 30,000 feet big picture view, which I think we really need to get some people organized around, is the manifesto and the missions. But all of them are important, I agree.
Ben, do you want to, because it might not come up yet, do you want to share a little bit about the grounded missions?
Yeah, so this is a little bit new to me. Marlika and Mark might know a bit more on it, but the mission idea is it goes from JFK's moonshot thing, and it was mostly about getting to the moon in the 60s, that kind of idea. And it was the idea of missions is at a national level, we would work to figure out 3-4 very key missions that might be social, environmental, to be determined, and choosing those would be really complex in and of itself. But you'd pick those, and then the idea would be that would help channel funds and energy towards those complex challenges in a really coordinated way across the country. And there would still be room and freedom for everybody to look at those differently with different communities and different lenses and perspectives, but it would be kind of an organizing, aligning force to be able to really work on these challenges. So that's the general idea. Making it grounded because typically, from what I understand, missions often come at a high level government level, and a grounded piece is to make sure that this is informed by citizens, in a good way, and balancing that in some way. So that's the general idea, and where we think, again, so if there's a missions approach, it wouldn't be that labs would be the only thing in missions. Labs would just be one small way of exploring complex challenges. There would be all kinds of other pieces that would fit within that. So that's a little bit about it, but I think my colleagues might know more about that stuff, so you can share on that.
You're just muted, Mark.
Thank you. I think you framed it nicely, Ben, and the reason I like that recommendation is that is one larger change strategy and an orientation to change in which a lab might make a contribution. And it happens to be one where there's a lot of energy right now and a lot of promise, but it ain't the only one, but it's a very good one because it's big. And that's a great example of saying labs can contribute to different modalities of making change, right? It's not a one size fits all sort of thing. And I'm going to make this point later a little bit. Labs are kind of like tofu. They absorb the context in which they're placed. And so how can we say if we want change, and there's lots of ways of making change, what's the lab contribution? And that happens to be one of the best and biggest ones right now. And there's more than that.
Yeah, these are all really great contributions to the question. And on the point of mission driven, like I do think this is already, it might not be called this way, but it's already happening in a way. When you look, for example, at the mandate letters that were just sent out in the province of BC, it lists like the big challenges up front and what each ministry should be working on. So a lab is not only a way to deliver on a mission or a way to do it, but actually also looking at the how it's being delivered. And is it across coalitions? Is it in a creative, experimental way? So I would say and that maybe goes back to what Jeff Mulgan and, the big thinkers around mission-driven innovation are saying is we do need to think about how to keep our institutions democratic. And democracy and institutional design within it is going to be so pivotal. And maybe labs can play a role in that too, in the design, in the way it's being delivered and organized.
Wonderful. Thank you all. Appreciated the opportunity to kind of hear around the recommendations from the Future of Labs Collective and what's resonating with each one of you. You also all played a really key role in the Future of Labs gathering, both leading up to it, conceptualization. You're part of the histories of Converge and other gatherings previous, participated on the island, helped kind of make sense of what we heard. And so we're also curious to hear from you on a more personal level. What's a key insight or a learning that you've personally taken away from your participation in Future of Labs?
Jump in. Thank you. I did enjoy thinking about this, and my learning was prompted, Marliki, by some of the conversations that you and I hosted at the event, and also prompted, Paige, by something you said in one of the sessions where we were kind of stuck bowling in mud around definitions and boundaries and, does a lab do this or that? And it builds on something I said a couple minutes ago. I really think labs are an orientation to change with some common principles and practices. And there is sort of a minimum spec. There is some foundational things about labs. But a lot of the times when we were debating things and having important debates, they were really important. They weren't trivial at all. They weren't really about labs, but they were about differences of opinions or contexts in which labs operate and how they show up differently. So one of the discussions we had was a big one about should labs scale or not. And Marley, we did it as a provocative game about where do you land on the spectrum and why do you do it? Not because we were searching for an answer. We were looking for what is the case for and against scaling, which is one dimension of the lab debate, everyone. There's more than that. And it occurred to me, if you're working in more mission-related big systems changes, scaling is important. It's central. The lab has to be designed and conceived and organized in a way that pays attention to scaling. Doesn't mean we can do it, but it's on your radar. There was a lot of groups working with local living labs, more locally based labs, which were trying to deal with local issues where scaling may not only be on the radar, but it might even be inappropriate, right? Someone's saying, I'm just trying to solve the problems in community X, and whether it scales or not, I wouldn't even pretend to imagine that. And that was also legitimate. And so I think I don't know if it's a learning, it's more like a working conclusion, which is that we might agree on some basic attributes of labs and agree that they show up differently in different places, but let's be careful about not mixing up the larger strategy and context in which things are embedded, and they might show up differently. Like those to me seem like we don't need to argue about those as much. We've got other things to argue about and debate, but no, I don't think we should spend as much time on that. So that was a working conclusion I had that I don't think I would have had we not prepared for Cortez and participated in those chats.
Thanks, Mark. I couldn't agree more. It was such a joy to work with you and this whole group leading up to the event, and then also during the event and post-event. Really strengthened the relationship. So that's something I'm actually taking away, is like those strengthened relationships and a deeper focus on relationality as the future of labs. But one other one that I wanted to mention, and I think Ben and I can continue this conversation. And I actually wrote a blog about the lab event on Cortes Island. I'll post it in the chat so you can see what my personal takeaways were from the event. But one that I wanted to highlight is actually like the role of joy, creativity, and art, and how pivotal those are in a time of public crisis where you really feel like that there's so much uncertainty, and that you have this feeling constantly of not being able to influence anything in a rational way, like in a, let's write a thing, or let's present a book and then everything will change, like, or let's do a lab. No. And there was one way of how it presented at the event was our colleagues Alex and Karen took their sort of like question into a humorous sketch. And we were sitting in a circle, and there was a beautiful wooden building in the forest, and we laughed straight for 5 minutes. Like the whole group couldn't stop laughing, because we were mocking ourselves around the concept of like, not being able to explain the lab concept to a funder. I think it was like, that was a scenario. And the laughing and the humor was so uniting, and the art of it was so uniting and freeing in a way. And I thought, oh, that's something that I want to bring more into my work. That's the art of the possible, designing the design futures work. That's something that I really take away, that I would like to apply more in my day-to-day. Laugh a little more, because it's dire times.
Awesome. So I was very on the same wavelength. I was like, choose awe around it. And I think in these tough times, like we need the relationality. There were a bunch of us in Edmonton. We call ourselves the System Buds. It managed to come together yesterday, and we connected and were able to talk about all these complexities, and people are working on all kinds of labs and systems challenges. So I think there is that, like, it is a choice. Awe doesn't happen to you. You have to choose it. You have to choose joy, all of those pieces. So I think there is something to that. And also with it, I think there can be a bit of a tension where you want to just go to this kind of really micro relational world with like our 100 people that we know, or something like that. And that's an important piece of working on this kind of grounded neighborhood level of change making. And at the same time, I think we also, this is what I was kind of thinking about for the future of labs, because there was sort of a conversation of, let's maybe move away from the big picture systems change stuff and move to the kind of neighborhood, community, place-based sort of change making. And it's probably a both and, but I think there's a piece when things get so overwhelming and complex, we might want to just shrink back to like the people we know and build those relationships. We need that to stay strong, but I think we also shouldn't give up on the big stuff of mission and the things we can influence. So I think that's a tension. And some people will gravitate more towards labs on that place-based kind of level in relational ways, and some will gravitate towards big stuff that we need to shift, and we need both because there's polycrisis and there's lots of things going on. And as you get into that, we need each other, and be kind to each other throughout that, and choose joy and awe, because it's not easy through that. So as much as that can sound like some kind of you know self-help book kind of thing, no, like there is something really to it, and the joy and all that complexity.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing, yeah, some of your reflections and your insights and learnings. To kind of cap off our discussion, we're want to talk about what's next. So wondering if you can comment on how this collective will keep its energy and sustain momentum. And you might also comment on how others who are listening might be part of furthering the work and vision of Future of Labs as it moves forward.
I can share a little bit. So, podcasts out, recommendations out, this is out. I mean, there is an element that we're looking at who can kind of hold the arc to kind of move this forward, and looking for funding around that. I think Social Innovation Canada, Action Lab, others want to be involved in helping steward, but also don't have capacity to do all the work around that. So we need collaborators on that. But so I think those will be some key pieces. And now it's kind of becoming clear that there are two streams. One stream is sort of around the supporting lab practitioners and opening, those who are interested in labs that are newer to it. So supporting that in some way, and the deep practices that people are doing for a long time. So that's all the field building pieces related to methods, practices, working on the value proposition, getting clearer on definitions for funders. That's that stream. And then there's a secondary stream, which is not quite for lab practitioners, although some of us might want to be involved, which is the manifesto stuff and the missions pieces. And we need different people in there to influence at those levels, and that it's a supportive kind of ecosystem building support around that. So I think those are two different streams, and we are looking for people that are interested in this and want to support around that. So I guess a bit of a call to action around, if you want to support in some way or be part of things. There is maybe going to be a gathering. We're looking at some possibilities in Halifax in June, but details and so that'll be like June 1 to 3 or 4-ish around there. But there's still more to be determined stuff on that. So field building, we're looking for people to support that, and then the manifesto mission stuff is maybe a few of us, but also a lot more and bigger picture. That's what I have to say about it, and I don't know what my colleagues think.
I'm just going to interrupt for a minute to let the audience know we'll be collecting questions to do a Q&A. So if you have some, you can start to put them in the chat now, so they're ready for that time. But Marlika and Mark, if you have any comments to add to that question.
Sure, thanks. Well, what's next? I think the next is already here in a way. In terms of I really see a lot of different little collaborations bubbling up from Cortez. So, for example, Nick Scott has a beautiful GovMaker podcast together with Jason Pearman, and he was at the lab gathering and invited some people in, and we kept on conversing and learning together in the podcast series. There's ideas here to do more research around policy labs and the potential of, governments running policy labs together with design universities and partners in the field and community action groups. So I feel like that's another piece where I feel like there is some momentum. Yeah, so and I would say, people are writing and speaking and showing up in these spaces already. It's more like how to make it into a concerted effort that gives some oomph to this next wave of Future of Labs.
I'll be brief because I like this arc quite a bit. Maybe a complimentary thought, and it's captured in a quote that I saw floating around. I'm not going to get the quote right, but I'll share it, and popped up in a chat that Ben and I had with Darcy Riddell the other night, who is deeply in this field. And then Ben, I saw you share it again with the YEG group about finding islands of coherence in complex, fast-moving, sometimes grumpy times. And so part of it is, I think there's a bunch of technical work to do and doing work. We have to do the work and show up and think and write and practice. And I think we have to find each other too. So we need islands of coherence on social innovation change, whether they're local. The YEG group, the Edmonton group met last night, I think, Ben, with a bunch of you, and that was terrific from the sounds of it. Locally, by theme, etc. I fear most the loss of agency and hope in tough times for people. Content comes and goes, and so we have to do this work, but we have to do it with some kind of agency and hope. And joy and laughter when you can get it, right? And we should be shooting for that. So yeah, I think undergirding this is connection, relationships, agency, and hope. And we've been using the phrase political or policy winter on some right now, and that might be what we're seeing in some contexts. I know it is around energy transition, but lots can be done in winter, prepping for spring. So that's what I think that's another piece of the pie.
Thank you all so much. We're going to hold about just under 10 minutes of space here for folks who are joining us. If there's any questions that we can put out to the panelists. Feel free to pop them in the chat. Okay, well, maybe I'll kick it off with a question. I guess, lots of energy, things emerging on opportunities and ways we can bolster the lab movement going forward. I'm curious, is there anything too that we should be mindful of regarding this work, or signals that you're sensing to hold on to? Yeah, Mark.
Well, I guess we all project whatever we're thinking about when we answer these questions a little bit, but I've been preoccupied with this for some time, and I think about it even more. And we touched on it in the lab thing, but it is when we look at the kind of change we want to have, call it impact or transformation or systems change, there's something about what is reasonable to expect from our work. And I don't mean it to encourage a shrinking of ambition. In fact, there's a great phrase that I've been hearing a lot called, think big, but shrink the change. Like shrink the change so it's manageable and accessible and we feel like we could move. And so it's not about not having big ambitions, but if in the field of labs, and we did a little bit of additional work, I think, everyone in Converge, not in Converge, in Cortez Island. What can labs do and not do? What can your strategy do and not do? And most change, quite frankly, on systems change is cumulative. It accumulates over time. And then there are big and small tipping points that sometimes you don't even know when they're happening, and they're somewhat perceptible in retrospect. And they're usually happen because a lot of other things happen. So I think our job is to make the biggest contribution with the time and energy and the space and the context we have, and then go on to something else and know that there's larger forces at work, but our job is to contribute. And so what does contributing to social change and innovation and change look like? Everyone's got to answer that in their own way, but I know the gap between our ambition and what we're able to contribute is often very big. So I don't know, what does shrink the change look like in any given change context? I think it's a good question to ask without diminishing ambition.
We do have a couple questions from the audience. Do we want to hop to those, or Marlika and Ben, did you have a comment that you wanted to share to Rebecca's question?
We can take some audience ones, I think.
Okay. There's a question from Andre. Would we ever do a labs showcase for funders to get to know more of the work and impact of labs in our ecosystem as a way to build new bridges and interest in providing additional resources to this work?
Yeah, I think one of the things that was talked about, and there will be, and like right now, the Future of Labs website, which is part of the Action Lab website. So I think we are going to build something that we can have people contributing ideas and think pieces and examples, and we're going to figure out a way so that people can source like different types of labs and show that there, because it's helpful. Like we're talking in abstract a little bit about labs, and for people that are a little inside on, they have some sense of what labs are. Having tangible examples of what they've worked on in policy levels and community levels, those kinds of things will be really helpful. So there have been examples shared in different places. We want to help support to collect those, and so that people can use those in different ways. And there have been different showcases at different times to show those examples in all kinds of different ways, for government and for different funders. Yeah.
Mark or Malika, did you have any comments related to that one?
Okay, we have, Malika.
Yeah, sorry, maybe not really to this question, but the question that you popped around, what is important to consider. I think one thing also that I took away from Cortez is like what I felt like is everyone is going through a bit of a maybe like even like personal transformation. Like at some point it all like everyone clicked at some point. It's like, oh, this is what's going on in the world. And I think it's really important to kind of like share your shapeshifter code with others, as in like what is your hard drive? Like, what is the shared value set that we're bringing together in these spaces? Because the transformation is sometimes sought like so much outside of ourselves when it comes to labs. But bringing that personal transformation into this work is so pivotal. And I really underestimated that element. And I think that is something that we need to keep thinking of when we go into the future of labs.
Thanks, Marlika. I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. We have a question here from Stephen. What role or roles do you see for labs as we navigate the world of disinformation and misinformation? Stephen's imagining example contexts such as local civics. Can labs help informing enough consensus around an issue to address ever widening gaps in how communities even view or recognize a problem? So yeah, labs' roles in navigating, the polarization and disinformation and misinformation.
Yeah, there's a lot of people talking about polarization labs and stewarding, and it's a complex challenge, polarization, that would be ripe for a lab. Now, one of the things is, are you doing a lab that needs to focus on immediate, like policies or things, or services or things you would do in order to work on polarization? Like, is that the expectation that people would have in a polarization lab? So you need to be producing something in 3-6 months, a year. That's a harder ask around it. Or is it a transformational lab where you're looking at larger time horizons? And we don't have a lot of time around. So I think that's a tricky thing around navigating it. But complex challenges, it's like there's little agreement on what the nature of the challenge is. There's many different perspectives on what the solutions and pathways may be. So polarization is a really, ripe and juicy and messy topic that could be explored around that. And there could be all kinds of creative, interesting ways to do that. So I think it is something that could be explored. And also, I think you'd have to be really careful on how that's being supported, and it doesn't get seen as having a lean one way or another, having this is a left-leaning thing working on polarization, or this is a right-leaning thing, and that would be a really hard piece to navigate in it.
Mark, you had a comment?
Yeah, I really like that, Ben, and thank you for the question. I think labs could also, every lab, if done well without turning itself inside out, is a vehicle for addressing polarization directly or obliquely. And why? Because if done well, and I've been in labs, and in fact, I'm starting to try and develop some resources on this that touches on the impact question you had, Andrea and Marlika, about connections in a lab and internal transformation. I've seen labs where people who were previously polarized or have very different views of the world have more insight and empathy into someone else's perspective, even if they don't agree. necessarily, but
Mhm.
more insight and empathy, and I would even say greater civic literacy because they understand a complex issue from another perspective. And that, in several cases, has led to partnerships and work between previously polarized parties.
Mhm.
And so I don't, you could probably do a lab directly on it, but good labs are kind of like a multi-solving platform. You can deal with multiple things at the same time, and it is for sure one way to, in a meaningful, practical way, address polarization.
Thanks, Mark. Should we do one more question, Rebecca? Yeah? Okay. Um, so we've got a question from Monica. Given shifts to the social innovation funding landscape, impatience with process perceived as slow or talk shops, seems we need an even stronger value proposition than ever. Thoughts on this? Something around the value proposition.
I think Action Lab is the best title ever because you have to combine both. But yeah, value prop is really, really important. And actually, slowing down is a form of resistance, right? Like it is actually, and if you can't do it in the formal spaces, you can always do it in the informal spaces, away from the more powerful players. And so I don't necessarily think it is bad to have slow spaces that way, but talk shops versus workshops, I'm not sure if that's a helpful narrative to contribute to. But I do believe that action and thinking and learning all need to go together, and labs are perfect spaces to do that. And I actually haven't had a problem in like showing the value proposition for that work.
Can I just voice over?
Yeah.
Chatting's kind of frustrating. So this is Monica. That was my question. I guess I'm noting an atmosphere of very constrained budgets and therefore a defaulting to the very conventional constrained ways of thinking and being. So that's what I'm referencing. And so certainly in our work, everything's taking longer, and even the kind of labs we may have proposed 10 years ago, there's no way we could sell them now because they were longer, they included overnight retreats. There was an understanding of the kind of spaces and a willingness to invest. And I think people are so lost the plot in some ways. I'm talking conventionally, right? Because we're
Mm-hmm.
used to online, we've even forgotten how to convene and the value of being in person. I feel like I totally resonate with everything that you were saying, Marlika, about the benefits. But I feel like in the, we sell work, right? The
Mm-hmm.
gradient to get over now is significantly different than it was even 5 years ago for
Mm-hmm.
people to understand the value. Once we actually get the first workshop, we're usually over that because then they're like, oh yeah, now I get it. This should have been longer and we should have had like all those people. But prior, it's harder than ever, is our experience.
Thanks, Monica. Yeah, and we're just at time. I'm mindful. So, Mark, do you want to just say a final comment in response to
Yeah,
Monica?
no, Monica's point is really powerful. I maybe will get really nerdy about the
Mm-hmm.
tactics, not the bigger challenge, Monica, that you raised. I took a sales course once by accident, and I say because I literally thought I was showing up to another course, but it was good. I learned something in any event, and I spent all this damn money on it. So, and what they did was they said, we have a lab that has inherent benefits and value that are somewhat universal and are true. But the manner, in order to sell that in any environment, they say don't be a supply side seller. Pay really good attention to who's buying and their context and find out what's important to them. And then you highlight the parts of your process that is appealing to them. Marlika, you talked about language, talk shop versus a workshop, etc. And it doesn't mean you oversell. You don't want to cheat or be disingenuous about what we're selling. But I think value proposition does depend on context. So context plus generic value, universal value proposition, plus a little bit of judgment and retailing of the message can improve the prospects a bit, even though, Monica, it doesn't get to the structural things that you're talking about necessarily. but I don't think we should supply side sell labs. I think pay attention to the context and then highlight those features of the labs that seem really relevant and viscerally needed in that context. It's not enough to get over what Monica's talking about, but it's a little bit closer.
Go a little bit more underground.
Little bit Trojan horsey. Yeah.
Yeah, a bit of more Trojan mice. We talked about the Trojan mice.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I'm sorry to kind of cut that last bit of juicy convo short, but we are at our end point. So I wanted to extend a big thank you to everyone in the audience for coming today. A big thank you to Social Innovation Canada for hosting this space, and a huge shout out to our panelists for taking the time to share your insights. So thanks, Ben, Marlika, and Mark. There'll be a few details, perhaps about some upcoming virtual events that might be of interest in the chat here. So you might want to wait and look for those before you pop off. But otherwise, thanks to everyone, and we hope you have a really great rest of your day.